Streamers of silver cloud wreathed a solitary moon, painting the rocky headland in patterns of shadow. The Druki raiders kept to the darkness beneath the trees that ran alongside the curving coastal road. Just ahead, around the bend of a rocky outcrop, lay their objective. Malus pulled the cloak of Ulthuan wool tighter about his shoulders. The ship's crew had washed out as much of the blood as possible, and they had to hope that the darkness would conceal the rest. In his right hand he held a looted spear, and the Sea Guard's heavy shield hung from a strap on his left arm. Beneath the cloak he wore a hauberk of Druki chainmail, similar in size and bulk to Ulthuan's scale armour. The silver helm was too big, and kept wanting to slide down over his eyes. He had hoped that the spearman's long blonde scalp would have given him extra padding he needed, but it still wasn't enough. There were nearly 100 corsairs in the raiding party, slightly more than 2/3 of the Manticore's surviving crew. Malus had been forced to leave Master Gull, Amaleth, and the navigator Shevel back on the ship with a skeleton crew. If the treacherous ship's master wanted to abandon him, he'd be leaving most of his corsairs behind as well. The Highborn hoped that would be enough to give the bastard pause. Gull had put the raiding party ashore just before midnight, 5 miles further north. After recovering his boats, the ship's master was supposed to take the Manticore farther out to sea to avoid detection, then swing back to a point 2 miles south to the town to pick up the raiders and their plunder. By Malus's reckoning, they had less than 2 hours left to make the attack and reach the pickup point. Lunara, Silar, and 4 other corsairs were also disguised in Ulthuan cloaks and war gear. The rest of the attackers wore dark cloaks and unadorned helms. In the darkness, they could pass for Lothern Sea Guard, so long as no one looked too closely. Malus turned to the first mate.
"Are you sure the rest of the raiding party knows what to do?"
She scowled at him from beneath the brim of her dented helm.
"It's not exactly complicated," she replied. "They've done this sort of thing before, you know."
"Fine," Malus growled. "Lead on."
The disguised Druki stepped out onto the road, and Lunara took a few moments to make sure the spearmen were arrayed in proper marching order before heading off. Malus walked alongside her, his spear resting against his shoulder.
"I can't believe we're doing this,"
she muttered.
"Neither can I," Malus said.
"This was your idea."
The Highborn chuckled under his breath.
"Well, yes. I just wasn't sure I'd live long enough to get this far."
Just past the outcrop of rock, the Druki found themselves at the north end of a broad, shallow cove edged with forests of dark green pine. The coast road ran on for another 100 yards or so, and ended before the high gate of the elven town. As Malus watched, the moon slipped from behind the clouds, and the pearly light gleamed off the white stone of the town's high wall and its tall, graceful buildings. He suppressed a shudder at the sight of the place. It was decadent and debased, with its gleaming white stones and jewel-like lamps. The Highborn could almost smell the weakness of its inhabitants, and felt the sudden urge to put it all to the torch. Globes of turquoise-coloured light shone at regular intervals along the top of the town wall, and Malus saw solitary figures pacing along its length. Lunara muttered a curse.
"They've been alerted,"
she murmured.
"I warned you about this."
"So, what does that mean, exactly?"
"At this hour, about 1/3 of the town watch will be on the walls and guarding the gates. The rest will be sleeping nearby, in full armour."
"How many warriors will there be?"
She shrugged.
"For a town this size? Maybe 100.
Malus grunted.
"Is that all? We can take them."
"If we can get inside the walls,"
Lunara hissed.
"Well then, you'd best be convincing, hadn't you?"
They marched along the road in plain view, their helmeted heads bowed as if in weariness. Malus could feel the eyes of the sentries upon him as they came up to the gate.
"Who goes there?" spoke a cold, quiet voice from above.
The language of Ulthuan was a debased relative of Druhir, but close enough that Malus could make out most of what the sentry was saying.
A shore patrol from the White Lion,
Lunara answered, her husky voice thick with feigned weariness.
The captain put us ashore north of here to look for signs of the Druki raiders. Have you seen anything?
None, the sentry replied. You say you're from the White Lion? I don't know that ship.
This isn't our normal patrol route, the first mate replied without skipping a beat. We'd been hunting pirates west of the Blighted Isle, and we were heading back to port at Lothern when we got word there was a raider in the area.
Lunara shifted from foot to foot.
May we enter, cousin? We'd like a place to rest our feet and get some food if we could. We've got another 5 leagues to march before the dawn.
The sentry didn't reply right away. Malus kept his gaze focused on the paving stones at his feet and tried to appear tired and bedraggled. Finally, the warrior spoke. Very well. Come inside. A ripple of tension ran through the raiders as quiet orders were passed beyond the gate, and the sound of heavy bolts being drawn back. The highborn turned and surreptitiously glanced back at the outcropping 100 yards distant. He hoped the raiders were paying attention and were fast on their feet. The tall gate swung open. Malus waited until Lunara started to move, then fell in line beside her. His hand tightened on the haft of his spear. There were 2 warriors on each of the gates, their spears laid aside as they wrestled the portals open. Beyond them, the road continued through an open square, where almost 20 soldiers slept or tended their weapons in a temporary bivouac. Malus felt his blood run cold.
"Blessed mother of night,"
he cursed under his breath. One of the warriors on the gate next to him raised his head at the sound.
"Did you say something, cousin?"
The highborn glanced up at the warrior, trying to think of a quick lie, and met the spearman's gaze. Too late, he saw the look of shock on the warrior's face as the warrior noticed the highborn's dark eyes and knew that their ruse was finished.
"At them!"
he yelled, smashing the rim of his oval shield into the spearman's face. The elf staggered backwards with a cry, blood spurting from his broken nose, and the highborn buried his spear in the soldier's throat. Shouts of alarm rang through the air, all around the Druki. Lunara threw off her cloak and helm and attacked the spearman to her left with a feral shriek. Silar dropped spear and shield and drew his longsword, readying himself as the first of the soldiers camped in the square charged at them. The second spearman to Malus's right turned and dashed for his weapon. The highborn reversed his grip on the spear and hurled it at the warrior, striking the elf between the shoulder blades.
"Stay beneath the arch,"
he warned the corsairs. They just had to hold the gate open long enough for their reinforcements to arrive, but with 7 against 40, he didn't think they were going to last very long. Malus raced to join Silar just as the enemy spearmen attacked. The young knight knocked a thrusting spear aside and caught his attacker full in the face with a backhanded cut. Another elf warrior charged forward and stabbed two-handed with his spear, driving the keen point through the mail, covering Silar's left shoulder. Malus stepped in with a snarl and severed the spearman's left arm at the elbow, hurling him back in a spray of steaming blood. As Silar pulled the spear free, the highborn stepped past him and caught another spear thrust against his looted shield. The enemy warrior, in his haste, had forgotten his own shield, and Malus made him pay for the error. His blade slipped beneath the edge of the spearman's scale hauberk and plunged deep into the warrior's guts. Screams and shouts of pain sounded all around Malus. More and more soldiers were joining the battle, and he was forced to give ground in the face of a thicket of stabbing spears. 2 of the corsairs lay dead beneath the gate arch, and another bled from a wound in his chest. Malus caught a trio of spearmen swinging wide to his right, and realised that they were trying to reach the gate. They could use the oak barrier to push the Druki outside. Cursing, Malus turned to rush at them, and then a spear thrust from his left glanced off his stolen helmet and knocked the rim down over his eyes. Yelling, he raised his shield to ward off another blow and fumbled with the unfamiliar helm, trying to shift it around and hold onto his sword at the same time. There was a searing pain in his left leg as a spear point sank into his thigh. Furious and blind, he knocked the weapon loose with the rim of his shield. Then a huge impact on his back knocked him off his feet, and a triumphant roar echoed in his ears. Malus covered himself with his shield as he hit the ground, and the bone-jarring impact sent the helmet flying. Heavy footfalls shook the ground all around him. The Highborn looked about frantically, and realised that the bulk of the raiders had finally arrived. Screaming corsairs raced out of the night and swept in a black tide over the startled defenders, driving them past the gate arch and back into the square. Within seconds, the battle was receding into the distance as the surviving spearmen retreated deeper into the town. Safe for the moment, Malus cast aside his shield and tried to check on the wound in his leg. Blood had already soaked through his robes and was dripping freely on the ground. Sillar stood nearby, stuffing a blood-stained rag into the hole in his armour. Seeing the Highborn's wound, the young knight forgot what he was doing and joined Malus.
How bad is it?
Sillar asked. Malus grimaced.
Damned if I know, he said. It hurts like the blazes, but I think I can stand.
It's bleeding freely, my lord. Best let me bandage it first,
Sillar replied, and began tearing strips from one of the dead spearmen's cloak. By the time Sillar had knotted the field dressing tight, the battle in the town was over. Lunara came jogging back to the gate, her sword dripping red, and her face spattered with gore.
I was wondering what happened to the 2 of you, she said.
Never mind us,
Malus growled.
What of the battle?
The first mate grinned.
The town is ours, she said. The garrison is finished, and we're searching the houses for captives. Looks like the women and children fled early in the day, though. Probably hiding somewhere up in the hills. Lots of plunder, though. So, we won't be leaving empty-handed.
Malus nodded as Sillar helped him to his feet. It wasn't a total victory, but not a total loss either.
Take everything you can, but be quick. We're running short on time.
It was just over an hour before the raiders were ready to move again, with 3 looted wagons laden with plunder and a coffle of 30 slaves. Losses among the raiders had been light, and despite the precariousness of their situation, the corsairs were jubilant as they set off down the southern coast road. Malus rode in the lead wagon, cursing the wound in his leg. He could walk, but there was no way he could keep up the pace to get to the rendezvous in time. The Druki gave their captive cousins a taste of the lash to hurry them along. They raced down the curving road, trading caution for speed and trusting in the fickle luck of the gods to see them through. It was just past the hour of the wolf when Lunara gave the signal to leave the road and make for the narrow strip of beach to their right. Malus focused his tired eyes and peered into the darkness offshore. If the manticore was out there, she was invisible in the night. Exhausted, the coffle of slaves collapsed onto the sand. Lunara barked another set of orders, and the corsairs got to work, posting lookouts and unloading the wagons. Sillar came up alongside the Highborn and searched the dark horizon as well.
You don't think he left us, do you?
The young knight asked, giving voice to Malus's fears.
Gull's chances of making it back to Clark-Arond with such a small crew would be very slim,
Malus said.
Even I know that.
Still, he thought, it could be done. He wished he'd insisted on having the navigator accompany the raiding party, but it was likely that even the crew would have balked at such a reckless notion.
They could have run into the other patrol ship, Sillar mused, or hit a squall and had their masts carried off.
Mother of Night, Malus hissed. Are you always this gloomy?
I prefer to say I'm no stranger to misfortune,
the young knight replied.
More's the pity,
Malus said. Then a glimmer of movement caught his eye.
There,
he said, pointing out to sea. The first of Manticore's longboats heaved into view, its roars straining mightily against the oars. A ragged cheer went up from the corsairs until a hissed warning from Lunara put their minds back on business. Within minutes, all 4 of the corsairs' longboats were being dragged ashore, and Manticore herself had hove into view, less than a mile from the beach, outlined like a ghost ship in the moonlight. Amaleth jogged up the strand, eyeing the raiders' haul. "Sailors and plunder first," the second mate suggested to Malus. "Then the rest of the crew and the slaves." He noticed a blood-stained bandage on the highborn's leg. "Will you head back with the loot?"
And look weak in front of the men?
Malus thought.
Oh no, that would only encourage Lurhan's hidden assassin.
The highborn shook his head.
"Get the boats loaded as quickly as you can,"
he said.
"I'll go with the second wave."
The second mate nodded. "Of course, sir," he said with a faintly mocking smile. Before Malus could reply, Amaleth had turned and was running back to the boats. They loaded the plunder aboard double quick, and less than 10 minutes later the longboats were rowing back to Manticore, burdened with loot and a third of the surviving raiders. Once there, however, it seemed to take hours to unload their cargo. Before long, Malus was looking worriedly to the east, expecting to see the first rays of dawn at any moment.
"What's taking them so long?"
Malus muttered. Just then there was a commotion from farther down the south road. One of the lookouts came charging onto the beach and delivered a breathless report to Lunara. The first mate sent the corsair back the way he came and hurried over to Malus, her expression grim. "There's a column of troops coming up fast along the coast road," she said. "Looks like the Sea Guard."
"By the Dark Mother!"
Malus swore.
"How did they get here so fast?"
Beside him, Sillar pointed out to sea.
"That's how,"
the young knight said. It was the warship that had chased Manticore into the mists near the Blighted Isle, her white sails billowing like wings in the moonlight. She was bearing down fast upon the Druki corsair, eager for revenge. The hunters had now become the hunted.
"Can our boats make it back to us in time?"
he asked Lunara.
"It doesn't look like it,"
she said, her voice hollow. Malus turned to the first mate and saw she was staring at the distant Manticore. The corsair ship was taking her boats aboard. Gull was abandoning the rest of the raiding party to its fate. In an awful flash of intuition, Malus saw the trap that Gull had sprung on him. The ship's master had delayed the offloading at the ship as long as he could to increase the chance they would be found. It was possible he'd even taken steps earlier to make the corsair easier to discover, and the timing had worked out to perfection. Gull now had a hold full of treasure, and just enough sailors to make it back home and claim Lurhan's reward. Lunara looked up at Malus, a stricken expression on her face.
"The Sea Guard will be here any minute," she said. "What do we do now?"
Malus straightened in his seat and took stock of their situation. Around 50 corsairs waited on the sand, surrounding 30 increasingly defiant slaves. Bile rose in Malus's throat. He shook his head. There was only one thing left to do.
"We die."
10 minutes later came the soft jingles of harness and the drumming of swift feet along the coast road, and the relief column of Sea Guard troops came swarming down onto the beach, weapons at the ready. The sight that awaited them left many of the young warriors reeling in shock. The white sands were black with blood in the fading moonlight. Dark-robed bodies lay everywhere, their limbs strangely contorted in death. Blood-stained figures in simple garb of fishermen sat or staggered about the scene of carnage, many with slave manacles still dangling from their wrists. Many wielded gory knives as they stalked among the dead. In moments, the leader of the column arrived at the beach, and he too was stunned by the brutality of what had happened. He pulled his winged helm from his head, his face pale with shock.
"For pity's sake, help them!"
He commanded his troops, and the spearmen put down their weapons and moved to help the survivors. The lieutenant bit back a wave of despair as he surveyed the awful scene. His gaze fell upon another villager, sitting alone against the side of a wagon's wheel. He approached the hunched figure, kneeling respectfully at his side. "We came as soon as we could, cousin. What you did here was very brave." The figure sighed.
I know,
he replied in a dead voice.
but we had no choice.
Before the lieutenant could reply, Malus drew a dagger from within his sleeve and stabbed the sorrowful elf in the eye. As one, the villagers leapt at the surprised spearmen, slashing and stabbing with their knives. Other corsairs leapt from the sands and attacked the elves from behind. In moments, the slaughter was complete. Lunara pulled off the villager's tunic she'd worn over her armour. Breathless, she staggered over to Malus. "The Lord of Murder favoured us," she gasped. "But what now?" The highborn levered himself painfully to his feet and pulled off his own disguise.
All is not yet lost.
He gestured out to sea.
Manticore wasn't as fleet-footed as Master Gull hoped.
Delayed by taking on their boats, and with only a minimal crew to work her sails, the corsair had been quickly overtaken by the elven warship, and now they were grappled together in a brutal boarding action.
These sea guards must have come ashore a few miles to the south,
Malus said.
Their boats are likely waiting for them on the beach. If we can reach them in time, we can still rescue Manticore and get ourselves out of this mess.
Lunara thought it over and nodded. "We'll load everyone into the wagons and ride the horses to death if we must," she said with a fierce grin, and turned to shout orders to the corsairs. As the raiders clambered aboard the wagons, Malus surveyed the blood-stained sands one last time. Killing the slaves had been the only way, he realized, but the loss still ate at him.
"Worth their weight in silver,"
he muttered, shaking his head in disgust.
I'll likely not see such a wealth again.
Manticore wallowed in the cold swells of the Sea of Malus as she limped the last few leagues back to port. It had been a long voyage back. The raider had suffered considerable punishment at the hands of the vengeful elves, and by the time Malus and the raiding party had managed to sneak onto the enemy warship's deck, Gull's troops had already been decimated. But the enemy captain had been overconfident, believing his troops had finished the raiders trapped on the beach, and had never expected a sudden attack from shore. By the time he realized his mistake, it had been far too late. The battle ended swiftly after that. Malus ordered the warship set ablaze, and the Manticore made good her escape, and rewarded the crew with the plunder he'd taken from the village in Ulthuan. In a single stroke he'd won the allegiance of the crew away from Hathan Gull. Master Gull had abased himself at Malus's feet when the fighting was done. His apologies were voluminous, and his pleas for mercy were most sincere. The Highborn gave the treacherous slug every opportunity to convey the depth of his regret, slicing off only a small part of Gull's body each day. The ship's master was still alive when Malus offered him to the sea witches as they passed the tower of Carent Car. Standing at the prow of the crippled ship, Malus fished into the small coin pouch at his belt. His fingers closed on a handful of rough objects, and he held them up to the sunlight.
All that plunder, and this is all the gold I have to my name, he said,
showing Silar and Lenara a handful of gull's teeth. The young knight shook his head and turned his gaze back to the docks of Clarkerond, just a few miles off the bow. Lenara chuckled. Melt them down and have them made into a set of dice, she suggested.
Perhaps I will,
the highborn mused.
What happens once we reach port?
Silar asked.
We're more than 3 months early, and you've nothing to show for your cruise.
The highborn shrugged.
I could have come back dragging Teclis by the hair, and it wouldn't have mattered,
he said.
I'll return to Haggrafe and start plying the flesh houses again. Who knows? I might even start breeding Norglia.
He regarded Silar thoughtfully.
I misjudged you, Silar. A poor knight you may be, and too honest for your own damned good. But you served me well. I'll release you from your oath here and now if you wish. You needn't accompany me back to the den of vipers at the Hag.
Silar chuckled.
And missed the look on your father's face? No, my lord, I'll accompany you.
Malus nodded, then turned to Lenara.
You, on the other hand, never gave me any oath. Gal is dead, and Amaleth was killed in the battle off Ulthwan. By law, Manticore is your ship now.
True enough, the first mate said. But I'm done sailing the seas. If you're still serious about taking me into your retinue, then I'll give you my oath. She smiled. But I expect to be well rewarded for my service.
You may wind up with more than you bargained for,
the highborn answered sardonically.
Speaking of bargains,
Silar interjected,
there's still a matter of who shot you on board that patrol ship off the Blighted Isle.
Malus frowned.
Ah, yes. Lurhan's hidden assassin. That was Amaleth, I expect. I saw him with a crossbow just before the battle.
It was him right enough, Lenara said. I paid a couple of corsairs to shadow him during the battle. Her expression soured. They weren't supposed to let him take a shot at you without my permission, though.
Your permission?
The highborn's eyes went wide with shock.
You knew Amaleth was Lurhan's assassin the whole time?
Of course. I kept him alive as insurance, just in case you had any treachery of your own in mind, Lenara replied. What, did you imagine I would take you at your word? For a moment, Malus was speechless, torn between murderous outrage and grudging admiration. Silar leaned against the rail and chuckled softly, staring out to sea.
Will be the death of you yet, my lord,
the young knight said.